In the heart of Silver Pine City, where towering glass skyscrapers touched the sky and sleek hovercars zipped through the neon-lit streets, one could find both the extreme of luxury and the depths of despair. Zane Valtor, a towering wolf with pristine silver fur and piercing sapphire eyes, was among the richest anthros in the city. The self-made millionaire, known for his business empire spanning tech, real estate, and entertainment, was a name spoken in admiration and envy. He walked with an air of authority, always dressed in the finest suits, his tail flicking behind him with calculated grace. But wealth hadn't come without its costs. He had sacrificed much relationships, friendships, and even a part of himself to reach the top. One rainy evening, as he stepped out of his luxury car, the patter of rain on the pavement echoed the thoughts in his mind. A charity gala awaited him in the Grand Valtor Tower, where he was set to make another generous donation that would boost his already gleaming reputation. But before he entered the building, something caught his eye, a shivering figure huddled near an alleyway. A beggar. Zane normally paid little attention to the city's homeless population. He had built his empire through ruthless ambition, believing in the philosophy that those who didn't rise simply didn't try hard enough. But something about this particular beggar made him pause. The figure was a canine, a golden retriever mix, wrapped in a tattered coat, his fur matted from the rain. His large ears drooped, his paws clutched an old, faded blanket that barely shielded him from the cold. Two dogs sat beside him. One was a scrappy-looking mutt with patchy fur, the other, Zane's breath hitched. His heart pounded against his ribs. The second dog was Knight, his knight, a German shepherd with a regal stance, black and tan fur, and the same mismatched eyes, one deep brown, the other a striking icy blue. There was no mistake. This was the same dog that had been his loyal companion years ago, the pup he had raised from a rescue, the one who had stayed by his side through thick and thin. But how was Knight here? With a beggar? Zane's mind reeled back to 5 years ago, when his business was expanding at an uncontrollable rate, and he had made a ruthless decision. He had been traveling constantly, managing investments, overseeing deals, and securing his place at the top. He had told himself that he had no time for distractions, not even for Knight. So one day, in a moment of cold calculation, he had given Knight away. A trusted assistant had arranged for him to be rehomed, and Zane had never looked back. Until now. Zane stepped forward, his polished leather shoes splashing in the puddles. The beggar, oblivious to his presence, was whispering softly to the two dogs, stroking their fur. Knight? Zane's voice was barely above a whisper, but the German shepherd's ears twitched. The moment their eyes met, something ignited a flicker of recognition. The dog hesitated, then slowly got up. His tail wagged once, uncertainly, before he took tentative steps toward the wolf. Zane crouched, his heart pounding. "Do you remember me, boy?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically raw. The dog leaned in, sniffing his hand. Then, in an instant, Knight's tail wagged faster, his ears perked up, and he let out a familiar, excited bark. The beggar, who had been silent until now, finally looked up. His eyes were tired, his fur unkempt, but there was something about him that made Zane pause. "Do you know my dog?" Zane asked, his voice steady but full of unspoken emotions. The retriever mix blinked. "Your dog." He let out a dry chuckle. "This here's Bolt. Had him for 3 years now. Found him in a shelter." Zane's mind spun. A shelter? That meant Knight had been abandoned, or worse, passed from home to home. A gut-wrenching realization settled in. He had betrayed his best friend, and now a stranger had taken care of him. "What's your name?" Zane asked. The beggar hesitated before sighing. "Elliot, just Elliot." Zane clenched his jaw. "I need to know, where did you get him?" Elliot frowned. "A shelter on the outskirts. They told me he'd been adopted and returned a few times. Said he had attachment issues." Zane swallowed hard. He had caused that. Knight knew Bolt had been waiting for him, probably searching for him every day after he left. And when Zane never came back, the dog had suffered. Zane inhaled sharply. "I want him back." Elliot's fur bristled. "Excuse me, he was mine," Zane said firmly. "I raised him. You left him." Elliot's voice was sharper than Zane expected. "You abandoned him, and now that you see him happy, you think you can just take him back." Zane opened his mouth, but no words came out. The millionaire, who had conquered industries, negotiated billion-dollar deals, and crushed competitors without a second thought, stood speechless in front of a homeless canine and 2 loyal dogs. And then, for the first time in years, he felt small. Elliot shook his head. Bolt isn't some trophy you can reclaim when it's convenient. He's family, my family, Zane exhaled. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. For years, he had believed money could solve anything. But here, in the cold rain, faced with a dog he once loved, and a stranger who had done what he failed to do, he understood. He couldn't just take Night back, but maybe he could do something else. Zane reached into his coat and pulled out a business card. I want to help you. Elliot narrowed his eyes. I don't need charity. It's not charity. Zane hesitated before continuing. You've done more for Bolt than I ever did. You deserve a second chance too. A silence stretched between them. Then, reluctantly, Elliot took the card. Zane stood up. There's a job opening at one of my shelters, full-time caretaker. If you want it, it's yours. Elliot stared at him. Then he looked at Bolt, who was still standing between them, tail wagging softly. For the first time that night, Elliot smiled. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. And as Zane walked away, he knew one thing for certain. For the first time in his life, he had finally done something right. Zane Valtor, the self-made millionaire, had always prided himself on his ability to take control of any situation. Yet, as he stood in the cold drizzle of Silver Pine City, face to face with a bedraggled retriever mix, who called himself Elliot, he found himself at a loss for words. Bolt stood between them, ears perked, tail wagging softly, as if sensing the tension. I want him back, Zane said finally, his voice firm but not unkind. Elliot, who had been scratching behind Bolt's ear, froze. His golden-furred face turned upward, eyes narrowing. Excuse me. Zane exhaled slowly, his posture straightening. He was mine once. I raised him. You left him, Elliot interrupted, his voice sharp and unwavering. You abandoned him. The words stung more than Zane expected. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this. Not by business rivals, not by employees, and certainly not by a homeless stranger. Elliot gave a short, humorless laugh. And now what? You see him happy, and suddenly you want him back. Zane clenched his jaw. It's not like that. Then what's it like? Elliot's eyes burned with an intensity that caught Zane off guard. You think you can just show up after, what years, say a few words, throw some cash around, and he'll come running back to you? Zane inhaled sharply, his gaze flickering down to Night Bolt. The German shepherd had stepped forward, ears twitching, watching both of them with an uncertain expression, as if waiting for something. I didn't know what happened to him, Zane admitted, his voice quieter now. Elliot scoffed. You didn't care what happened to him. Zane's ears flattened slightly. He was not a man who accepted guilt easily. He had spent his life pushing forward, making ruthless decisions, convincing himself that sacrifices were necessary. But this was different. I thought I was doing what was best, Zane finally said. Elliot's expression darkened. Best for who? Certainly not for him. Zane exhaled, his hands balling into fists at his sides. I was building something. My company, my future. I was never home. Spare me, Elliot growled, standing up. His tail flicked behind him in agitation. And for the first time, Zane noticed just how thin he was. You think you're the only one who's ever struggled. You think you're the only one who's had to make hard choices. Zane's ears twitched. Elliot took a step closer, jabbing a finger toward the millionaire's chest. I lost my job 2 years ago, had a steady gig as a mechanic until the shop got shut down. Landlord kicked me out when I couldn't make rent. You know what I didn't do? His voice lowered, dangerously calm now. I didn't dump Bolt somewhere because he was inconvenient. Zane flinched. The weight of those words settled deep in his chest, heavier than he cared to admit. Elliot shook his head. I found him at a shelter. He was terrified, pacing his kennel, looking out every time someone walked by, like he was waiting for someone. Zane felt like he had been punched in the gut. Night Bolt had been waiting. For him. I had nothing, Elliot continued, his voice quieter now. Still don't have much, but I made sure he was safe. I fed him when I barely had food for myself. I kept him warm when the winters got bad. He's not just a dog to me, he's family. Zane swallowed hard, his gaze dropping. Family. He had once told himself the same thing. That night was his family. But when it had mattered most, he had walked away. Zane hesitated, his fingers flexing. I made a mistake. Elliot stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to gauge if those words meant anything. Finally, he let out a long sigh and scratched the back of his head. Yeah, he muttered. You did. Silence hung between them, broken only by the soft sound of rain against the pavement. Zane looked down at Night Bolt, who was watching him, ears flicked forward, waiting. A part of Zane still wanted to take him back, to fix his mistake. But he couldn't. Not like this. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek, matte black business card. He held it out to Elliot. What's this? The retriever mix asked, not taking it. Zane exhaled. I own several animal shelters. One of them needs a full-time caretaker. He paused, his voice softer now. If you want it, the job's yours. Elliot's brow furrowed. He glanced at the card, then back at Zane. Why? Because you did what I couldn't, Zane admitted. You took care of him. A long pause stretched between them. Then, slowly, Elliot reached out and took the card. Bolt wagged his tail, stepping forward and nudging Elliot's hand, as if sensing the change in atmosphere. For the first time that night, Elliot smiled. Just a little. Guess I'll think about it, he murmured. Zane nodded. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for the first time in a long, long while, he felt lighter.